The Sci-fi war had dragged on for decades, and Earth's fleet, once a formidable force, now fought a losing battle. The alien invaders' advanced weaponry and psychic prowess had decimated humanity's defenses. Entire colonies had fallen, their populations scattered or enslaved. With no reinforcements in sight, Earth's last hope rested on a project that had been shrouded in secrecy for years: the Hidden Force. Dr. Elena Ward, a brilliant yet controversial scientist, had warned of humanity's latent potential long before the war started. While most dismissed her theories as the ramblings of a dreamer, she had quietly assembled a team to test her most radical idea. Humanity's strength, she believed, wasn't in its technology or weaponry, but in the untapped abilities locked within the human genome itself. A dormant force, passed down through generations, hidden beneath layers of evolution. A power that had been forgotten, suppressed, or buried so deeply that no one had thought to awaken it. Until now. Ward's lab was located beneath a remote military complex, far from prying eyes. The walls were lined with archaic texts, digital projections, and strange artifacts she had spent years accumulating. Her team of researchers worked tirelessly, blending cutting-edge science with ancient techniques. At the heart of the project was the activation serum, a complex concoction designed to stimulate and unlock the dormant potential buried within human DNA. But there was a problem. No one knew what the side effects would be. Kane had been chosen not for his combat experience, but because of his potential to survive the process. A decorated war hero with a history of pushing boundaries, he was a natural fit for the military's new initiative. Captain Marcus Kane had always believed in the strength of his people, but even he had no idea what he was walking into. When the serum was injected, the effects were instantaneous. At first, nothing happened. Kane felt a slight tingle, a mild warmth spreading through his body. He had been warned it might take time for the serum to activate. He was instructed to rest, but his mind raced with the weight of the decision. Humanity's future rested on his shoulders. As minutes passed, a strange sensation began to take hold. His senses heightened, the colors of the room seeming more vivid, sounds sharper, smells more distinct. He could hear his own heartbeat in his chest, each thump louder than ever before. But it wasn't just his senses that were changing. Kane could feel something stirring within him, like an untapped reservoir of power waiting to be unleashed. A flash of light erupted in his vision. He jerked upright, overwhelmed by a sudden surge of energy. His body pulsed with raw power, and for a brief moment, he thought he might lose control. But he didn't. He steadied himself, his heart racing. The sensation began to stabilize, and Kane realized something extraordinary. His body was stronger, infinitely stronger. His muscles felt like steel beneath his skin. But it wasn't just physical power. It was a connection to something deeper, something primal. The doors of the lab slammed open. Dr. Ward stood there, her eyes wide with astonishment. It's working. It's really working. Kane turned to her, trying to speak, but his voice caught in his throat. His mind was racing with 1,000 thoughts. He could hear her, feel the energy around him, but also, in the distance, the faint echo of something else. A far-off presence. For the first time, he was aware of it. The force inside him was not just a power, it was an intelligence, ancient, vast, and sentient. Kane stumbled back as the world around him seemed to vibrate, his pulse quickening. Dr. Ward's face lit up with hope. "Captain, you've unlocked it. The hidden force. It's real." Kane could only nod, his mind overwhelmed by the implications. But before he could speak, a military officer entered, his face grim. "Captain, we've just received word. Sci-fi ships are on the move. They're attacking the colony on Tiburon 7. It's a full-scale invasion." Kane looked at Dr. Ward, his hand clenched at his side. His world was no longer just the fight for survival. It was about to become something far greater. He wasn't just humanity's weapon now. He was the key to winning the war. and something deep within him, something ancient, was awakening, ready to be unleashed. Captain Marcus Kane stood in the command center, staring at the holographic display of the Sci-fi fleet. The once proud human ships were barely a match for the aliens' advanced weaponry, but Kane knew that now everything had changed. The power inside him wasn't just a tool, it was a force of nature, something that could reshape the very fabric of the war. He wasn't sure if he could fully control it yet, but the urgency in the officer's voice had made one thing clear. The fight for humanity's survival would begin now. "We have to move, Captain," Commander Sullivan urged, his eyes fixed on the swirling lights of the enemy fleet. "We can't wait for reinforcements. The colony's defenses are crumbling. You're our best chance." Kane nodded, his gaze shifting to Dr. Alina Ward, who had joined him in the command center. She had been a quiet presence ever since he had activated the serum. Despite her scientific brilliance, he could see the nervous tension in her posture. She knew what they were about to do. She was hoping he was ready. The serum had only been tested in small doses, on controlled subjects, but Kane was about to lead a full-scale assault with a team of newly activated soldiers. They were the first of many, but their success or failure would determine the course of the entire war. Kane's heart pounded, but not from fear. There was something else now, something new. He felt the surge of power within him, a growing pulse, a thrum deep in his bones. "Captain," Ward called, her voice trembling slightly. "We don't know the full extent of the serum's effects. If it's too much, you cold." "I know the risks," Kane interrupted, his voice steady but low. "But it's too late to back out now." Dr. Ward hesitated for a moment, then nodded. She trusted him, but she wasn't sure if even he could handle what was about to happen. A few hours later, Kane and his team boarded a modified human warship, its hull reinforced and fitted with new technologies designed to amplify the powers of the awakened. As the ship entered hyperspace, Kane could feel his senses stretching outward, his connection to the ship, to the people around him, becoming more acute. He could feel the tension in the air. The soldiers were uneasy, unsure of what they had become and what they were about to face. "Everyone, listen up," Kane barked, his voice carrying authority even as his thoughts raced. "This is not just a mission. This is our chance to prove we're more than just survivors. We're the future of humanity. Stay focused. Follow my lead." He knew they had no choice but to succeed. Their first test would be the hardest. The Sci-fi would expect a conventional attack. They wouldn't anticipate what was coming. As the fleet dropped out of hyperspace above Tiburon 7, the scene that unfolded was one of devastation. The planet's surface was scorched, the remains of its once vibrant cities smoldering in the wake of Sci-fi bombardment. A handful of human ships fought back, but their odds were slim. The Sci-fi were merciless. Kane's heart raced as he watched the drop zones light up. A heavy silence hung over the ship before he issued the order. "Go," he shouted. The drop pods released with a thunderous roar, hurtling toward the surface. As Kane's pod hurtled through the atmosphere, he felt the familiar sensation of gravity warping around him. His mind surged with energy, and he concentrated, manipulating the gravitational pull to slow his descent. The pod slowed, and Kane leaped out moments before impact. He landed with a force that cracked the earth beneath him, sending a shockwave of energy rippling outward. His muscles burned with power, and the ground trembled as he focused the gravitational energy to create a shockwave that sent Sci-fi soldiers flying in all directions. Kane was no longer just human. He was something far beyond that. He felt invincible, untouchable, but the battle was far from over. The Sci-fi, caught off guard by his power, quickly regrouped and retaliated with their own advanced weapons. Kane raised his hand, feeling the pulse of energy building in his palm. He released it in a concentrated burst, a wave of raw energy that blasted through a line of Sci-fi soldiers, leaving nothing but molten wreckage in its wake. But something unexpected happened. As he stood among the wreckage, Kane heard a voice, a faint whisper, like a distant echo in the back of his mind. It wasn't his own thoughts. It was something else, something ancient. His mind flitted to it for a split second, and in that instant, his powers shifted, becoming more chaotic, harder to control. "Captain," a voice called out from his communicator. "We've got more incoming, fast." Kane shook his head, pushing the mysterious sensation aside. There was no time for distractions. He could feel the pulse of energy deep within him growing stronger by the second. It was calling to him, but there was no answer yet. "Kane," one of the soldiers shouted, pulling him from his thoughts. "We need you now." The battle raged around him. The awakened soldiers had already begun to wreak havoc on the HFY, but Kane knew that their true test was still ahead. His team was just beginning to realize the full extent of their powers, and that was both a blessing and a curse. He could sense the power, untapped, wild, waiting to be unleashed. But in the back of his mind, a nagging thought lingered. What if the power was too much to control? What if the very force that could save humanity was the one thing that could destroy them all? The battle for Tiburon 7 had been fierce, but in the end, humanity emerged victorious. The Sci-fi forces were driven back, their ships retreating into the dark reaches of space. For the first time in years, Earth had gained a significant victory, but it came at a cost. The power unleashed by the awakened soldiers was both a blessing and a curse. They had defeated the invaders, but the toll it had taken on their minds and bodies was evident. Kane stood among the wreckage of the battlefield, feeling the familiar pulse of energy that had become a constant part of him. He had never felt so alive or so uncertain. His team had done the impossible, but the power within them was growing uncontrollable. The soldiers around him, some still adjusting to their newfound abilities, looked both exhilarated and afraid. Dr. Alina Ward had insisted on joining the mission to Tiburon 7, convinced that the battle's outcome would provide invaluable data for her research. The serum she had developed had proven effective, but the after effects were more than she had anticipated. As she reviewed the data from the battlefield, her face grew more and more tense. "There's something happening to the serum," she muttered to herself as she analyzed the results of the activation. "It's changing them. The power isn't just physical, it's mental, spiritual even. These soldiers, they're not just stronger, they're becoming something else." Kane turned toward her, sensing the shift in her demeanor. "What are you saying, Dr. Ward?" She looked up from her tablet, her eyes wide with a mixture of awe and fear. "This power, it's linked to something much older. There's a genetic imprint in human DNA, something that was lost long ago, something from before." Kane felt a cold chill wash over him. Before? Before what? Dr. Ward hesitated, clearly grappling with the enormity of the discovery. "Before the war, before we even knew what we were capable of. I've been looking into ancient texts and archaeological sites. There's evidence of a forgotten civilization, one that predated all known human history. They possessed abilities like this, powers that could manipulate energy, space, even time." Kane's brow furrowed. "You're saying this isn't the first time humanity's had access to this power?" "No," Dr. Ward confirmed, her voice growing more urgent. "It's not. The genetic blueprint that allows us to tap into the hidden force, it was here long before we ever thought to harness it. But something happened. Something catastrophic that erased this knowledge. It was purged, wiped from our collective memory. I think the Sci-fi know this. I think they've been suppressing it for centuries." The implications of her words hung in the air like a dark cloud. Kane had always believed humanity was the underdog in the galactic struggle, but this new revelation suggested that Earth's true power had been hidden for a reason. Had the HFY been keeping humanity down, not just because of their technology and military might, but because they feared what humanity could become? "We need to understand this," Kane said, his voice steely. "We need to know everything." Dr. Ward nodded, but her expression remained troubled. There's more. I found a reference to an ancient event, something that might explain why this power was lost. It's mentioned in a series of texts recovered from an ancient site on a moon called Lizara IV. The texts suggest that the civilization that once wielded these powers destroyed themselves, and their downfall was tied to an energy force they could no longer control. Kane felt a shiver run down his spine. If we're not careful, we could end up just like them. I don't think it's just about the serum anymore, Dr. Ward said, her voice barely a whisper. This is bigger than any of us. The Sci-fi knew about this, maybe even from the very beginning. They've been manipulating the course of human history to prevent us from unlocking our true potential. Kane turned to the soldiers around him. They had fought valiantly, but they were more than soldiers now. They were the key to something far greater and far more dangerous. How do we stop it? Kane asked, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at the back of his mind. Dr. Ward looked at him, her gaze piercing. The key lies in understanding the origin of this power. If we can unlock its true source, maybe we can control it. But we'll need to go to Lizara IV. That's where the answers are. Kane clenched his fists, the weight of responsibility heavier than ever. Then we go to Lizara, prepare the team. As the orders were passed through the ranks, Kane couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into a trap, one set by the X-Cipher long ago. The power that had saved them on Tiburon 7 might be the very thing that would doom them all. But there was no turning back now. Humanity's destiny, and perhaps the fate of the galaxy, lay in the secrets buried on Lizara IV. The question was no longer whether they could control the power, it was whether they should. And if the answer was no, what would they do when they discovered the truth? The journey to Lizara IV was swift, but every passing hour only deepened the unease growing within Captain Kane. His connection to the hidden force had been expanding, as though the power was pulling him in different directions, testing his control. At times, it felt like a living entity pushing against the confines of his mind. He could feel the energy in his bones, the hum of raw power that coursed through his veins, but he still didn't know how to control it, didn't know if he could. Dr. Ward had briefed him and his team about the artifacts they had uncovered on Lizara IV, about the ancient civilization that once held dominion over this power. But the texts were cryptic, full of vague references and incomplete records. They hinted at a great catastrophe, a destruction so total that it erased not only the civilization but the knowledge they had gained. The only thing that had survived was the dormant genetic imprint left in humanity's DNA. We're approaching the system. The pilot's voice broke through Kane's thoughts. Lizara IV is in orbit around the third planet. Kane gave a short nod. He had been briefed on the basics, but none of it prepared him for the scene that greeted them as the ship entered the orbit of Lizara IV. The planet was nothing like Earth. Its surface was covered in ancient ruins, sprawling cities that looked like they had once been advanced beyond imagination, now weathered and crumbling. The atmosphere was thin and toxic, but nothing that a properly sealed suit couldn't handle. "We're landing," the pilot announced. "Prepare for touchdown." As the ship descended through the toxic clouds, Kane's mind sharpened. Something felt wrong. There was an oppressive silence about the place, as though the very air held secrets too dangerous to share. As the ship's engines rumbled in the distance, Kane felt a pressure in his chest. The energy inside him stirred, reacting to the planet's eerie stillness. The landing gear touched down with a soft hiss, and the team disembarked, their boots crunching against the alien soil. The ruins spread out before them like the remnants of a forgotten empire, a civilization that had once reached the stars only to be lost to time. "We've been tracking the signal from an ancient temple just ahead," Dr. Ward said, her voice steady despite the unease in the air. "The texts indicate that it holds the answers we need, everything we've been searching for." Kane nodded, motioning for his team to move out. The air was thick with dust, and the architecture of the ruins towered over them, broken but still imposing. As they advanced deeper into the ancient city, Kane's senses heightened. The energy in the air felt alive, as though the very planet itself was charged with the same power he had begun to harness. It was subtle, a low hum that vibrated in the ground beneath their feet. Dr. Ward led them through the ruins, carefully scanning the environment for any signs of traps or hidden dangers. The architecture was strange, alien in its design, yet there was a certain familiarity to it. Kane couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them, something ancient, something aware. When they reached the temple, it stood like a monolith against the backdrop of the crumbling city. Its entrance was flanked by statues of long-forgotten figures, their eyes carved to stare into eternity. The massive stone doors of the temple seemed to pulse with energy, as if they were waiting for someone to come and unlock them. "This is it," Dr. Ward said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Everything we've been looking for is inside." Kane felt a surge of energy rise within him, more intense than before. His connection to the hidden force was growing stronger with every step, like a beacon calling him forward. There was no turning back. This was the moment he had been waiting for, the moment where humanity's past, present, and future would converge. He stepped forward, reaching for the doors. The moment his fingers brushed against the cold stone, a flash of light exploded in his mind. The world around him blurred, and for a moment, he was no longer standing in the ruins of Lizora IV. He was somewhere else, someone else. Visions flooded his mind, images of the ancient civilization that had once inhabited this planet. He saw them harnessing the very energy that now flowed through his veins. He saw their rise to power, their unchallenged dominance, and their ultimate destruction. They had not only unlocked the hidden force, they had overused it. The energy that had granted them godlike powers had ultimately turned on them, consuming everything in its path. As the visions faded, Kane staggered back, gasping for breath. The temple doors creaked open, revealing a chamber filled with strange symbols, their meaning lost to time. But at the center of the room, an artifact sat upon a pedestal, glowing with a faint, pulsing light. "That's it," Dr. Ward said, her voice filled with awe. "That's the source, the artifact that powered their civilization." Kane took a step forward, his body trembling with the weight of what he had seen. He knew what had to be done. But as his hand reached out to touch the artifact, a cold voice echoed in his mind. "The energy is not for you to control." He hesitated. The power was growing within him, urging him to take it, to claim it. But the warning from the past hung in the air. Could he control it, or would it destroy everything he and humanity had worked for? Kane's hand hovered over the artifact, the pulsing light bathing the chamber in a faint otherworldly glow. His pulse quickened, his mind swirling with the force he could feel building within him. The energy, the same force he had tapped into during the battle on Tiburon 7, was calling to him, pulling him toward the artifact as though it were his birthright. It felt as though the universe itself was bending toward this moment, and yet something deep inside him resisted. The voice that had echoed in his mind, the warning from the ancient past, rippled through his thoughts again, louder this time. "The energy is not for you to control." Kane's hand wavered. He had come this far, driven by the belief that this power was humanity's key to victory, but the ancient vision he had seen, the fall of the long-lost civilization, nagged at the back of his mind. They had controlled the energy too, and it had consumed them. "Captain?" Dr. Ward's voice broke through his internal struggle. She stood just behind him, her face pale with awe and fear. "What's happening? You're not listening to it, are you?" Kane slowly turned to face her, his eyes narrowed. "I'm not sure what's happening, Elena. But this power, it's not just a tool. It's alive." Dr. Ward's gaze flickered between Kane and the artifact. "I know," she said quietly. "That's what the texts warned about. They were just using the power. They were merging with it. Over time, it became part of them, until they couldn't tell where the energy ended and they began. and then it consumed them. It wasn't a weapon, it was a living force. Kane's breath quickened as he turned back toward the artifact. The pulsing light was stronger now, vibrating in harmony with the energy inside him. It was calling him, seducing him with the promise of power, of an end to the war, of victory for humanity. But at what cost? A sudden movement in the corner of his vision caught his attention. One of the soldiers, a young man named Private Harris, stepped forward, his eyes wide, his face expressionless. His body radiated the same energy Kane had been feeling, but there was something different about the way Harris moved. Kane's instincts screamed at him to stop, but it was too late. The private reached out and touched the artifact. The room seemed to explode. A shockwave of raw energy surged outward, knocking everyone to the ground. Kane's body slammed against the stone floor, and the world around him spun wildly. His mind felt like it was being torn apart by the force of the artifact's awakening. For a moment, Kane could hear nothing but the ringing in his ears. His heart pounded in his chest, and the power inside him surged to the surface. He could feel it now, not just within him, but everywhere. It was in the walls, the air, the very ground beneath him. The artifact was amplifying the hidden force, making it stronger than he had ever imagined. And now, it was awakening the dormant power in every soldier in the room. He struggled to stand, his vision blurry, his body trembling. His thoughts were fragmented, but one thing was clear: this wasn't supposed to happen. "Private Harris," Dr. Ward cried out, but the words were lost in the cacophony of energy. Harris had collapsed to the floor, his body twitching as waves of energy coursed through him. His skin was glowing, his veins shimmering with light, and his eyes had turned a strange, luminous white. Kane moved toward him, his mind racing. What had happened to Harris? The young soldier was no longer himself. He was something else, something other. "He's not in control," Dr. Ward shouted. "The artifact is amplifying the serum, making it, merge with the power completely. We have to stop it." Kane reached out to Harris, but before he could touch him, the soldier's body convulsed violently. A shockwave of energy erupted from his form, blasting Kane backward. The force knocked him into the walls of the chamber, but his body absorbed the impact without much pain, his enhanced strength barely even registering the blow. The energy radiating from Harris was overpowering. It was unstable, spiraling out of control. "Do something!" Dr. Ward yelled, frantic. "We can't let this spiral any further. If this continues, we'll lose everything." Kane's chest heaved as he pushed himself to his feet. He could feel the energy thrumming beneath his skin, begging to be unleashed. The hidden force was no longer just a weapon, it was a ticking time bomb. Harris had been the first to succumb to it, but what would happen if it spread to the rest of the team? He closed his eyes for a brief moment, reaching deep within himself. His mind sharpened, and he focused on the energy within his body, the power that surged through his veins. It was no longer just raw strength, it was something more. He had learned to control it before, but this was different. He had to restrain it, to hold back the flood of energy before it consumed everything. With a grunt, Kane summoned all his willpower and reached out toward Harris. He called on the hidden force, the true force, the one that had always been more than just power. Slowly, Kane's body began to glow with the same light, his veins shimmering with the same pulse as the artifact. He wasn't just using the energy now, he was becoming it. "Stay with me, Private," Kane muttered, gritting his teeth. "We have to control it. We have to." But then the unthinkable happened. The artifact's pulse intensified, and Kane felt it, a violent, consuming pull, as if the very fabric of his being was being ripped apart. The power wasn't just amplifying anymore, it was taking over. Before he could react, Kane realized the truth. The hidden force was no longer something humanity could control. It was something that controlled them. Kane's vision blurred as the overwhelming energy surged through him. every cell in his body vibrating with an intensity he had never felt before. The room spun, and the oppressive hum of the artifact echoed in his mind. It was like 1,000 voices speaking all at once, urging him to give in, to surrender to the power. For a moment, he thought he might lose himself entirely, consumed by the very force he had tried to harness. But something within him refused to yield. A primal instinct kicked in, pushing back against the tide of energy. The hidden force was real, but it was a wild, chaotic entity, untamable by human hands. He had been wrong to think he could control it. "Focus," he muttered to himself through gritted teeth, the word barely audible over the roar of power. He closed his eyes, forcing himself to breathe. He had learned to control his enhanced strength, his heightened senses, but this was something else entirely. The power wasn't just part of him, it was overwhelming him, drowning him in its fury. And Harris was the perfect example of what would happen if they didn't stop it now. Kane pushed forward through the haze, struggling to keep his mind intact. The young private's body was writhing on the floor, his skin now an unnatural shade of white, veins glowing like tendrils of pure energy. It was clear that Harris had lost himself completely to the artifact's power. The soldier wasn't even conscious anymore. He was merely a vessel for the force, a puppet to the will of the energy. Dr. Ward was frantic, scrambling to make sense of the disaster unfolding. "We need to shut it down," she shouted, but there was no clear way to stop the artifact. Its power was resonating with the energy inside each of them, amplifying everything. The more they tried to resist, the stronger it became. Kane knew they were running out of time. "We don't have time to figure out how to shut it down," he said, his voice barely a whisper. He took a deep breath, extending his senses beyond the chamber. The entire planet, Lizora IV, was teeming with this power. The artifacts scattered across the surface. This one temple, the ruins, it was all part of a vast, intricate network that had once powered an entire civilization. And now, that network was waking up. "I think," Kane said, his voice faltering, "I think we're not just dealing with a relic. We're dealing with the heart of the civilization. This energy, it was alive. It was meant to be shared, connected." Dr. Ward's eyes widened. "You mean?" "Yes," Kane said. "This is the core of their power, and it's trying to reconnect. It's too strong for just one person. If we don't stop this, it's going to take all of us." The thought was terrifying. The idea of merging with the energy as the ancient civilization had done, becoming one with it, was the only way to stop the chaos, but it was also the path to total destruction. Kane could feel the power building within him, his body thrumming with energy. The choice was clear now: either submit to the power fully and completely, or risk everything, allowing it to spiral out of control. Kane's mind flashed back to the visions he'd seen earlier, of the ancient civilization's rise and fall. They had allowed the energy to consume them. They had become gods in their own eyes, wielding immense power, but it had turned against them. It had broken their minds, shattered their civilization. They had lost everything. And now it was his choice. "We need to combine our strengths," Kane said, his voice steady despite the chaos around him. He knew he was taking a tremendous risk. "We need to form a link, all of us. We can't control it alone, but maybe together." "Together?" Dr. Ward repeated, her eyes darting to the rest of the team. "But that means—" "I know," Kane said, cutting her off. "We don't have a choice. If we don't stop it now, the energy will destroy us all." Dr. Ward hesitated, then nodded grimly. "Okay, let's do it." One by one, Kane reached out to the rest of the team, focusing on the energy within them, allowing it to flow toward him. He could feel each of their individual powers: a soldier's strength, a medic's agility, a scientist's sharp intellect, merging with his own. It was a dangerous gamble, but it was the only chance they had. The moment their powers converged, the force within them exploded outward, a brilliant flash of light filling the room. Kane's body trembled with the collective power of the team, but it wasn't just his own power anymore. The artifact pulsed in response, as if recognizing the unity, and for the first time, Kane felt something shift. The energy wasn't attacking him, it was aligning with him. The hidden force, once a chaotic, uncontrollable entity, now flowed in harmony with their combined will. But even as the power stabilized, Kane could feel the danger still lurking beneath the surface. The energy was not defeated, it was merely contained. The civilization of Lizara IV had tried to do what they were doing now, but their hubris had led them to ruin. The force was too great, too ancient to be fully understood, and it would never be fully controlled. "We've stopped it," Kane said, his voice heavy with the weight of their victory. "But this isn't over. This power, it's not meant for us." Dr. Ward nodded slowly. "We've only bought ourselves time. But time is all we have now." As Kane looked around at his team, he realized the truth. They had just crossed a threshold. The hidden force was no longer just humanity's weapon. It was their curse, their legacy. The question now wasn't if they could control it, but whether they could live with it. The light from the artifact flickered and dimmed as the energy receded into the walls of the chamber, now quiet and still. Kane stood at the center, his chest rising and falling with each heavy breath, sweat beading on his forehead. His muscles ached from the strain of holding the power back. The collective force of the teams was still surging beneath the surface, like a storm waiting to be unleashed. Harris lay motionless on the floor, his body still aglow with a strange light. The private's eyes were wide open, though there was no recognition in them. He had been consumed by the artifact's energy, a living vessel for a power beyond understanding. Dr. Ward knelt beside him, her expression tight with both fear and pity. "We need to get him back to the ship," she said quietly, her voice shaky. "He won't survive long like this." Kane nodded, though he didn't look at Harris. The soldier's fate was sealed. They all knew it. The energy had merged with him too completely, consumed him entirely. There was no saving him now, not without sacrificing something of themselves. The risk had been too great, and though they had averted the immediate crisis, they had not escaped the consequences. Kane could feel it in every fiber of his being. The force, that living energy, was still there, lurking just beneath the surface, waiting for the next crack, the next moment of weakness. "It's not over," Kane said, his voice hollow, as though the words themselves were heavy with the weight of the truth. "We've contained it for now, but it's only a matter of time before it breaks free again." Dr. Ward looked up from Harris, her eyes filled with exhaustion and fear. "What are you saying, Captain? That we're just going to keep running from it?" "I'm saying we need to understand it," Kane replied, shaking his head. "We've barely scratched the surface. If we don't learn how to control this, really control it, we'll be no better than the ancient civilization that created it." "And what happened to them?" His voice trailed off, the implications of his words sinking in. Ward stood slowly, her gaze drifting over the room, lingering on the artifact at the center. "The texts never told us everything. The fall of their civilization, it was sudden, catastrophic. We thought we could avoid their mistakes, but I'm not sure we can." Kane's fists clenched at his sides. "We don't have a choice. We need to keep moving forward. If we don't find a way to control this power, we won't just lose ourselves. We'll lose everything." The rest of the team gathered around, their faces drawn, their eyes haunted by the shared realization of the danger they now faced. It was clear they were all wrestling with the same question. Could humanity control the hidden force, or would it destroy them like it had destroyed those who came before? "Captain, we've made it this far," Sergeant Drake said, his voice firm but tinged with uncertainty. "What's next?" Kane looked at each member of his team, his mind racing. They had come for answers, for a way to turn the tide in the war. But now they had found something far greater and far more dangerous than they had ever anticipated. The hidden force was no longer just a weapon in their arsenal. It was an existential threat, an ancient, living power that could either elevate humanity to godlike heights or consume them entirely. "We need to return to the ship," Kane said, finally making a decision. "We need to get to safety, regroup, and then we'll figure out how to use this power. How to contain it, but we can't do it here." Not with the artifact still pulsing in the background. Dr. Ward nodded, standing up. "I'll stabilize Harris. We can't risk any more exposure to the energy. If we move quickly, we might be able to save the rest of the team from this." Kane turned away from the chamber, his mind already calculating their next move. They had to reach the ship, but the journey back through the ruins of Lizara IV would be perilous. The power of the artifact had already affected them in ways they didn't fully understand, and Kane could feel it in every step. The energy inside him was still restless, a storm waiting to break loose. As the team made their way back toward the ship, Kane's thoughts lingered on the one question that had yet to be answered. Why had humanity been chosen to inherit this power? What was the true purpose of the hidden force? Was it a blessing, a gift meant to propel them to the stars? Or was it a curse, a dark inheritance that had been waiting for the right moment to destroy them all? Kane could feel it now, tugging at his mind, the force pulling him toward an answer. He didn't have all the pieces, but he knew one thing for certain: the hidden force was no accident. It had been waiting for humanity, and now that they had touched it, there would be no going back. The planet seemed to pulse with energy as they moved through the ruins, the oppressive weight of the power hanging in the air like a storm cloud. Kane could almost hear it calling to him, promising answers, tempting answers, if only he would let go and surrender. But the vision of Harris, of the private consumed by the energy, stayed in his mind, a warning of the price that would be paid for such knowledge. They had to control it, or humanity would be lost. The journey back to the ship was grueling, each step weighed down by the enormity of what they had uncovered. The ancient ruins of Lizara IV stretched around them like the bones of a forgotten world, silent witnesses to a tragedy that had unfolded millennia ago. The hidden force pulsed beneath the surface of the planet, a silent, watchful presence, as though it were aware of their every movement. Kane's mind was a storm of conflicting thoughts. The power inside him, a force that had once seemed like humanity's salvation, was now a terrifying responsibility. The promise of victory against their enemies, the allure of godlike power, still beckoned in the distance. But the images of Harris, his eyes blank, his body nothing more than a vessel for the energy, haunted him. Was this power a gift or a curse, and who had the right to wield it? As they neared the ship, Dr. Ward stayed close to Harris, whose condition had only worsened. The private was barely breathing, his body still radiating with the energy of the artifact. Despite her best efforts to stabilize him, the power had taken a deep hold on him, and there was little she could do now but ensure he didn't descend into complete madness. Kane's stomach twisted as he glanced at the rest of the team. Sergeant Drake, Corporal Vance, and the others walked in silence, their faces drawn, haunted by the knowledge that they had been altered by the very power they had sought to control. The ship loomed ahead, a beacon of safety in a world that had just revealed its deepest secret. But as they approached the landing bay, Kane felt an undeniable shift in the air. The pulse of the hidden force was growing stronger again, resonating with his every breath like a beckoning whisper. It wanted him. No, it needed him. He hesitated, stopping in his tracks. The others paused, looking at him with confusion. "Captain," Dr. Ward called out, her voice concerned. Kane closed his eyes, his hands clenched at his sides. The energy was rising, pushing against his control. The weight of the decisions ahead bore down on him. He had always known humanity had potential. They had the ingenuity, the resilience, the courage. But now, facing this vast, ancient power, Kane was no longer sure whether they were ready for what lay ahead. "We need to make a decision," Kane said, his voice hoarse. We can't just take this power back with us, not without understanding it. We need to know what it wants from us. Dr. Ward stepped forward, her face pale but resolute. I agree, but what are you suggesting? We can't just leave it behind, can we? No, Kane replied, shaking his head slowly. We need to confront it. We need to know what it is, what it was meant for. We've seen the consequences of misusing it, and we've seen how it amplifies everything. But if we don't understand it, we risk repeating the mistakes of the past. This energy, it's alive. It's been waiting for humanity, and now that we've awakened it, it's our responsibility to learn from it. Kane's eyes turned toward the artifact in the heart of the ruined city, visible even from the ship's landing bay. The energy pulsed, its light flickering and shifting with unnatural speed. There was a depth to it, something ancient and profound, that he could barely comprehend. We can't just use it, he said, turning back to his team. We can't just keep it locked away and hope for the best. We need to decide if we can truly wield it, if we can understand it without being consumed. Dr. Ward swallowed hard, and if we can't, then we have to destroy it, Kane said, his voice firm. All of it. The silence that followed was heavy. Each team member seemed to grasp the weight of Kane's words. The power of the hidden force was too great to be left unchecked, too dangerous to simply be locked away. It was an ancient force that had once destroyed an entire civilization, and now humanity stood at a precipice. The decisions they made in this moment would determine whether they would ascend to heights unimaginable or be lost to history, as the Lizarans had been. Sergeant Drake spoke first, his voice steady but filled with a resolve that mirrored Kane's. We've come this far. We can't back down now. We need to face it, learn from it, but we'll do it together. Kane met his gaze, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he felt a flicker of hope. They were no longer just a team of soldiers. They had become something greater, united by the knowledge that they held the fate of humanity in their hands. But it would be a delicate balance. The force that pulsed beneath the planet was not a tool to be wielded. It was a living entity that demanded respect. They could not approach it with arrogance or fear. They had to learn its true purpose, or risk everything. Dr. Ward's voice was softer now, but no less determined. We'll find a way, together. Kane nodded, his mind made up. We'll return to the artifact. We'll unlock its secrets. And when we do, we'll decide if we can use it, or if we have to destroy it for good. As the team made its way back to the artifact, the weight of their mission bore down on them. The ship's engines hummed softly in the background, but the true journey, one of understanding, of confronting the hidden force, was just beginning. Kane's hand tightened around the comms device in his pocket. Whatever lay ahead, he knew one thing: humanity's future was no longer in the hands of fate. It was in their hands, for better or for worse.